Hello, whisperers. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy tonight's tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It helps more than you know. Now, dim the lights, and let's begin tonight's story. Dalton said it the second we stepped off the airboat and my boots sank ankle deep into the mud. Why do we have to hunt a fucking mudstalker? He said it loud, but it still sounded like a whisper, like he was afraid the trees might hear him. I couldn't blame him. Even the name made my stomach tighten. Everyone in our line of work knew mudstalkers. You didn't study them. You prayed you never saw one. Mercer didn't answer him. He was staring out into the swamp like he was waiting for something to move. The morning fog rolled low along the water, thick and slow, hiding the roots and dead logs and whatever else lay under there. I said, because no one else will. Dalton let out a sharp breath that wasn't a laugh. Yeah, wonderful, great. We moved slow through the trees. Whatever sanity I had left was fading with every squelch under my feet. The air felt wrong, heavy, thick enough to choke on. You could taste rot in it. Like the swamp wasn't full of water, it was made of dead things. And then we saw why. The first corpse was pressed against a cypress trunk. A man, or what was left, hanging like he'd been shoved into the bark. Ribs cracked, skin torn, legs gone below the knee. His jaw hung crooked, like someone tried ripping it off and gave up halfway. Dalton froze. Nope, no way, that's not normal, even for us. Mercer walked closer, careful. He crouched, studying the gouges in the tree. Dragged, Dalton snapped. Dragged by what? A goddamn forklift? No, Mercer murmured. Something strong. We moved deeper, bodies everywhere, some floating face down, bobbing gently with the current, some wedged between roots, some half buried in the mud so only a hand stuck up, reaching like it had been trying to claw out before the swamp swallowed it. And some were shredded so bad I couldn't tell if they were hunters, locals, or fishermen who took a wrong turn. The stench hit next, thick, sour, oily, like wet meat left in a hot car. It got in my throat so hard I could taste it. At one point I had to press my sleeve against my mouth just to keep from gagging. Dalton whispered, "Luke, if this thing is leaving all this out here, what happens when it gets close? To us?" I didn't have an answer. We kept walking until Mercer raised a fist. Stop. The swamp got quiet. Too quiet. No frogs, no bugs, no birds. Just this deep, low hum under the water, like something massive shifting its weight. I felt it in my boots, in my legs, in my teeth. Something was down there. Something big enough to make the mud tremble. Dalton stepped back. No, I'm not doing this. We shouldn't even be here. Keep your voice down, Mercer said. It feels vibration. We stood still, barely breathing. Across the clearing, something floated toward us. A torso, just a torso. And a head. It drifted slow until it bumped against Mercer's boot, flipped over. I saw the face, eyes swollen, mouth torn at the corners like someone stretched it too far, and the neck, The edges weren't bitten or ripped. They were melted. Dalton saw it too. It dissolves them? It actually, before he finished, something huge shifted under the water. A ripple, wide enough to bend the lily pads, deep enough to make the mud quake. Mercer whispered, "It's watching." I swear the air temperature dropped, not because it was cold, because my body didn't know how else to react. My skin prickled. My eyes started watering. Dalton raised his rifle, but his hand shook. We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be anywhere near this thing. Then, slow, very slow, something broke the surface 20 yards ahead. Not all at once, piece by piece. First, the top of a head, hairless, smooth, wet. Then 2 slits where eyes should have been. Then a mouth that was too wide, too flat, with mud dripping off the edges like it didn't belong on land. It didn't make a sound. It just rose, tall enough that its shoulders cleared the water, wide enough that I understood how the corpses ended up the way they did, wrong enough that every instinct I had screamed to run. Dalton whispered, "Luke, what the fuck is that?" I swallowed. My throat hurt. My brain scrambled for words. Mercer answered for me. Mudstalker. The creature sank back under without a splash. Gone. The swamp went silent again. Dalton grabbed my coat with shaking fingers. "Why are we hunting that? That thing can kill a man without even letting him scream." "I know," I said. "Then why us?" "Because if we don't stop it..." I looked at the corpses floating behind us. It keeps eating. The hum under the water started again. Deeper, closer, hungrier, and for the first time since we stepped off that boat, I knew something. We weren't hunting it. It was calling us closer. It wanted us in deeper water. It wanted us right where we'd drown. The deeper we moved into the swamp, the thicker the air got. It had this taste to it, like old pennies and swamp gas, and the smell never left your throat, no matter how shallow you breathed. Dalton kept his rifle tight and close, scanning the water's surface in quick motions that didn't match his usual calm swagger. Every few minutes he muttered something under his breath, small things like how quiet the birds were or how the ground felt like it wanted to swallow him. Mercer walked slower than normal, taking care not to break any more branches than necessary. The mud changed color as we went. At first, it was the usual bayou gray, but it started to darken into something closer to maroon, mixed with patches of a darker, almost black sludge. I noticed bones half submerged in places where the surface looked still. Some were small, probably deer or raccoon. Others were leg bones the size of a grown man's, stripped almost clean except for thin strings of rotted tissue. Dalton tried stepping wide around them, but mud sucked at his boots if he moved too quickly. Every step made a quiet, bubbling sound that seemed to echo too far for the size of the movement. We started to see more of the previous teams the government had sent in. The first body was wedged up against a fallen tree, half submerged in mud, arms hanging loose behind it. The skull was cracked on one side and caved in on the other. His jaw had been torn off entirely, leaving only a smooth curve of bone and dangling tendons. Mercer crouched beside him and scraped the mud away from the man's chest, looking for signs of bite patterns or tool marks. He didn't find any. The wounds were too violent to be precise, and the edges of the fractures had a wet softness that meant the skull didn't break against anything solid. Farther in, we found another victim leaning against the trunk of a cypress tree, almost as if he had been placed there. His torso had been opened from the sternum down to the hip, the ribs bent outward like broken wings. The inside was hollowed out except for the spine, which was snapped in two places. Dalton stared at the body for a long moment before wiping mud off the man's dog tags. The motion looked automatic, like his hands were acting before his mind caught up. Mercer touched the split ribs and nodded once, as if confirming something he had already suspected. We moved on because standing still felt wrong. The swamp never quite stopped making sound, but every noise seemed distant and unfocused. It was like everything living had moved away from this place on purpose. Even the insects stayed low, drifting in small clouds far from the water's edge. The trees stood tall but twisted, and some of them looked smooth in places where the bark had been scraped away. The marks were wide and uneven, as if something with too many joints had dragged itself upward. A narrow wooden walkway appeared ahead, half collapsed and slick with algae. It dipped under water in the center and rose again near a cluster of cypress roots that formed a natural arch. The handrails had snapped and leaned outward at strange angles. Dalton touched one and frowned. The wood felt soft, not from rot, but from repeated impact. It reminded me of the way bone looks after it's been gnawed down to the marrow. I stopped near a stretch of water that seemed darker than the rest and lifted my flashlight. Something shimmered just under the surface. At first, I thought it was a reflection of the trees, but the shape was too defined. It was a rib cage, still held together, the spine attached and curved in on itself, like the body had been folded. The mud had crept up around the bones, forming this unsettling cradle that held them gently in place. It didn't look like a natural death, and it didn't look like a scavenger kill either. It looked like something had taken the body apart slowly and arranged the pieces. Mercer whispered that the Mudstalker was territorial. He said it didn't eat the bodies for sustenance, but for something closer to instinct. The destruction wasn't random. It was deliberate and patterned, which meant the creature was aware on a level that made him uneasy. Dalton wiped his palms on his coat, even though they weren't sweating. The air was far too cold for sweat. We reached a clearing where the swamp floor dipped into a wide pool of opaque water. 3 bodies lay nearby, half in and half out of the shallows. They were arranged in a crescent shape, heads pointed toward the tree line and feet angled inward. One man's arm was missing, the socket torn open and packed with wet leaves. Another's torso had been cracked open like an egg, ribs splayed so far apart that I wondered how much force it took to bend bone like that. The third was face down, back split along the spine, skin hanging loose like shredded cloth. The air around them felt heavier. It was the first time the swamp didn't feel empty. It felt observed. As we studied the bodies, bubbles rose from the center of the pool, one at a time at first, slow and infrequent, like something exhaling beneath the surface. Dalton's voice dropped low as he backed up a step, boots sinking deeper into the mud. Mercer raised his rifle and motioned for me to follow his lead. There was no excitement in his movements, only caution and something like resignation. Another bubble rose, then two at once, then a cluster. The water didn't churn. It only pulsed. Dalton whispered that this was why no one came back. Not the gore, not the disappearances, not even the threat of the creature itself. It was the knowledge that the swamp wasn't waiting. It was breathing. Something shifted under the water, quiet, slow, deliberate, and the mud along the bank trembled in a way that didn't match the wind or the weight of any one of us. Mercer stepped closer to the tree line and watched the pool like he expected the surface to open. I felt the same thing he did, not fear of what we had already seen, fear of whatever hadn't shown itself yet. The Mudstalker wasn't hiding. It was choosing, and we were standing in the center of its choice. The mud around the pit trembled in slow, uneven pulses, as if something beneath the surface was breathing with the earth. The air smelled thick with rot, like old blood and wet leather, and the corpses scattered across the clearing made every step feel like we were walking through a crime we had arrived too late to prevent. Dalton stood beside me, pale beneath the grime and sweat, staring at the water with an expression that was more resignation than fear. Mercer crouched at the edge of the pit, tracing the muddy bank with the barrel of his rifle. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he already knew where the fight had to end. The Mudstalker's tracks were everywhere. Deep, heavy impressions where it had dragged men into the pit, and lighter ones where it had slithered out. The thing clearly preferred the water, but now that we had seen the way it tore into bodies, it was obvious it needed air, even if it wished it didn't. I swallowed hard as I scanned the clearing. The gore around us wasn't old. Some pieces were so fresh they still steamed in the humid air, and a few torsos were torn open so violently that their ribs pointed outward like wooden stakes. There was no movement anywhere else, which only made the silence more unnerving. The Mudstalker was close, watching, waiting for us to step too close or too careless. Dalton finally broke the quiet, his voice low and tired. It dragged them here, like it was feet in the ground. Whatever this thing is doing, it isn't hunting because it's hungry. He nudged a severed arm with his boot and stepped back when the mud swallowed part of the wrist. It's doing this because it understands how to scare people. Mercer stood and brushed his gloves together. It's not a spirit. It's not cursed. It's an animal that grew too specialized for its own good. If it needs air, we can use that. He looked at me like he needed confirmation that I was still with him, and I nodded because it was the only real option we had left. The Mudstalker's head rose from the water with almost no sound at all. Only the faintest ripple marked its emergence, and its eyes, black reflective pits with a faint sheen of milky film, locked onto Mercer first. Its jaw unspooled slowly, skin stretching in strands, revealing teeth arranged in layers like a shark that had grown tired of symmetry. The thing didn't lunge right away. It watched us, and the tension in the air made my shoulders ache. Dalton whispered under his breath, "It's smarter than anything we've dealt with so far." He shifted his rifle, but he didn't raise it. The Mudstalker pivoted its head slightly, as if it understood the gesture, and sank halfway back into the water without breaking eye contact. I stepped forward a few inches, just enough to feel the soft ground absorb my weight. The mud gave slightly, threatening to pull me in if I stayed too long in one place. The Mudstalker reacted instantly by gliding closer, the water trembling above its shoulders. It moved like something made of nerves alone, every muscle reacting before thought had time to form. Mercer nodded at me and then pointed subtly toward the heavy logging chain lying half buried in the muck. The plan formed without needing words. The water was its strength and its weakness. If we forced its head down and kept it submerged, its lungs would betray it faster than its claws could tear us apart. Dalton eased to the side to grab the chain while the Mudstalker slid nearer. Its body was only partially visible, but what we could see showed thick, matted flesh that seemed swollen from constant saturation. Its arms were long enough that it could rake the mud bank with its fingers while keeping most of itself underwater. And when it exhaled, bubbles rose with a sound like something boiling beneath the earth. I lifted my rifle and fired 3 controlled shots into the shoulder mass I could see above the surface. The rounds punched into it with muffled wet cracks, and the creature recoiled, slamming its forelimbs into the mud bank hard enough to send a spray of muck across my legs. Dalton moved fast, using the distraction to loop the chain over a thicker part of its exposed torso. The Mudstalker jerked violently, dragging him partway toward the water. But Mercer grabbed the chain with both hands and dug his boots into the mud. The struggle felt almost quiet, despite the chaos of movement. The creature thrashed in bursts, its limbs striking the mud with enough strength to send tremors up my legs. But its breathing grew labored. Each inhale sounded wet and shaky, and the way its chest expanded showed exactly how much oxygen it needed to stay alive. We had the right idea. We just needed more leverage. Dalton repositioned the chain one more time, wrapping it under an exposed ridge of bone or cartilage at the base of the creature's neck. It bucked so hard the chain snapped taut, and my boot slid several inches toward the pit before I caught myself. The Mudstalker's claws tore deep ruts into the mud, flinging chunks in every direction, but we held our ground through sheer necessity. Mercer grunted softly as he shifted his stance. "Push it in, all the way." He didn't raise his voice, but the strain was clear in the way each word left him. I braced myself, stepped closer, and planted my heel against its shoulder. The creature twisted, trying to bite, but its jaw couldn't reach with the chain locking its body against the pull. The moment it lost balance, we moved together. The chain went tight again as we dragged downward, and the creature slid into the water with a heavy, sickening splash. The surface churned violently as it realized what was happening. It rolled, clawed, and struck at the bank with frantic precision, each movement quieter than it should have been, but filled with enough force to drag all 3 of us an inch at a time toward the water. Dalton dug his boots into the mud so deeply that sludge covered his shins. He looked like he was ready to pass out, but he didn't loosen his grip. Mercer leaned with his full weight on the chain, and I followed suit, feeling my knees pull and my shoulders strain. The Mudstalker's thrashing slowed after what felt like too long. The bubbles coming up from the depths became smaller and farther apart, leaving streaks of disrupted mud rising lazily to the surface. The chain felt less alive in our hands. The water stilled just enough that I could feel the absence of movement, like a quiet, unwelcome truth settling in my bones. After a few more minutes, the water was still, Dalton straightened slowly and wiped his hands on his coat, though it didn't make them any cleaner. "I can't believe that worked," he said, his voice exhausted but steady. The clearing around us felt strangely hollow, like the tension had been removed, but the world hadn't caught up yet. Mercer exhaled and stepped back from the pit. He didn't smile. He just looked at the water with the same expression he'd had when we found Elias back in Montana. "Everything breathes," he said quietly. "Everything dies when it can't." I stared at the water a little longer, waiting to see if anything would rise. Nothing did. The Mudstalker was gone, and the only sound left was the distant hum of insects and the slow dripping of mud returning to stillness. When the extraction boat arrived, there was another folder waiting in the seat beside me. Dalton didn't have to ask. He just leaned his head back and closed his eyes, and Mercer stared straight ahead, like he was already preparing for whatever came next. I opened the folder anyway. A photograph of a snow-covered town, a church steeple bent at an angle, tracks leading up the steps, tall ones, and the next hunt began forming in the back of my mind. The way a bruise spreads under skin.